Coming up is an interview with an extremely advanced meditator. Dr. Daniel Ingram claims to have achieved the fourth and final stage of enlightenment. Whether you believe that or not, neuroscientist Dr. Judd Burrow and his team put Daniel in a brain scanner and found that his brain is indeed very different from the average person.
Like, I didn't miss any, which is apparently unheard of. And so he actually presented it at like a 400-person international neuroscience conference. There was sort of weird disbelief. So the other thing is I clearly can basically turn on and off my default mode network when I want to and hold it in whatever state. And so that's why they kept having me come up to UMass and play on their scanners.
In this interview, we talk about how Daniel's direct perception of the world, basically how his brain perceives reality, is dramatically and permanently different.
So what permanently stopped was the mind's obsession with trying to figure out which of these transient sensations was a stable self. At 18 and a bit years, it hasn't seemed to have done that again, which is cool.
We also talk about how the eradication of an I, self, or me totally changes how the brain operates.
You got to a point where you increase that mental resolution and the speed of perception so much that you had checked under every single rock that there was to check all at once, and there was no self, and then your brain was like, oh, this guy just proved that there's no self. And
right.
Now
that's basically
you
it.
Permanently, really? Okay.
We also talk about Daniel's meditation technique, what actually happened in that brain scanner, and myths about what enlightenment actually is. If this interview leaves you intrigued or confused, I recommend you check out my Substack series titled Is Enlightenment Real? The link is in the description.
I'm Dr. Daniel Ingram. I'm the acting CEO and board chair of Emergence Benefactors and help organize a group called the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, or EPRC, that is dedicated to ontologically neutral research that helps upgrade the relationship between science, the clinical mainstream, the public, and practitioners and patients regarding what we're calling emergent phenomena, which most people would call spiritual, mystical, magical, energetic, psychedelic, etc. phenomena. And I also do some things related to meditation and help run a site called the Dharma Overground. And then I'm a retired ER physician. So I've got a bunch of different Daniel. There are a bunch of different Daniels, really, and they all have a different relationship to some of these topics.
I was introduced to you and your book through a friend, and he kind of, we were just having a chat about something totally different. And I asked him what else is going on with him recently. He's like, well, I was reading this book and the author was saying that basically enlightenment does exist. There's a specific path to achieve it. And if you can practice this quite specific skill, it's essentially a skill you master. And then the endpoint for some, probably a very few some, is enlightenment or one of the milestones on the path to it. So I think that's already a bunch to break down. I don't think too many people would think of enlightenment as an actual thing that happens to real people. So why don't you just go ahead and explain for us kind of what is different about your perception of the world now versus before you started your meditation journey?
Yeah, and hopefully I'll do that in some kind of way that gives a sense of how you might actually do this, right? So hopefully it's practical for you, whoever's watching this, that you'll be able to do something useful. And the nice thing is the description of the upgrades point very clearly to straightforward steps that might make this more likely. Again, we don't know all the factors that lead to this happening. We have guesses, and the traditions all have their opinions, which are very interesting to listen to and think about. The first things I started noticing were some more space around thoughts and increased ability to perceive phenomena arise and vanish and things like that. And emotions then starting to move through more quickly, less sort of sense of contraction into them. And eventually, as things progressed, there was this sense of awareness kind of recognizing something of it being more diffuse in the space, so that each phenomena, wherever they were, seemed to know themselves where they were. And then finally, the last remnants of something that seemed to be a separate, stable, doing, controlling, knowing entity eventually were seen as just more patterns of transient sensations, all of which knew themselves where they were and were happening very normally in a causal way, sort of inevitably and all immediately. So obviously experience is always occurring now, and this moment is very transient. And so that's what's now different, is that before there was this sense of a stream of intentions. Oh, I'm going to do something, that seemed to be from a doer or something that was an agent, something that stood outside of causality and looked at it as a separate thing. Oh, that's the world happening there, but I'm really this thing here making decisions. When, science clearly says that doesn't seem to be true. Not that science is necessarily right about everything, but there is this sense now that is very different, that this stream of intentions once clearly perceived, that precede phenomena like, I'm going to think a thought. I'm going to think a thought. And that happened before I said thought was the intention to say it. And it was the intention to say the thought or whatever. And so that right before things happen, I'm going to move my hand towards the camera, or I'm going to pull my hand back. That sense of, you know what you're going to do before you do it, right? But it turns out that intention stream is not actually a separate controller. That just, if you pay more attention to it, you notice it's just arising as a stream of things that happen naturally like everything else. And then the sense of the controlling agent eventually is seen through, and it turns out that is better. So it seems like you'd lose control or freak out, or who would you be? No, it just feels much better, regardless of your ontological assumptions. And then there's a sense of like a mental impression that follows things that really seemed to be a knower, right? So it really seemed that I was in here somewhere, knowing things out there. But that's actually, curiously enough, not even what science says. So the scientific model is that this is all sensations in a brain somewhere, that there is no true red or blue or flavors or textures or whatever. These are all highly filtered, highly processed impressions that have to do with, photon energies and, the average kinetic, resonance of molecules that gets interpreted as warm or cold or whatever. But warm and cold and colors don't actually exist. They're just the ways a mammal somewhere creates this impression of the world. And that happens to be true of all these sensations and even the brain. So we usually think that ends here and this is the real thing. No, science says this isn't even the real thing. Like all of this is impressions in a mind somewhere, and we don't know where that mind is. So, but that's how this entity appears to function. So by starting to notice mental impressions, we're actually just more sensations. So for example, if I go, and then you remember that, it turns out the thing you're remembering that sounds like a snap, but is actually vastly more sort of silent and transparent, and your memory of the snap, and you try to play it back in your head, doesn't sound like the snap exactly. It's different, right? And it turns out the first incidence you heard of that snap happened right after it. So there was snap, and then there's this mental impression that was much like it. And we kind of miss the first one, except we think it is the knowledge of it, right? We think that it was the knowing, that the thing that happened after the snap that we play back is actually the mental knowledge of that thing. This is the observer, the knower. And so it turns out that when you get your attention more clear and refined and precise, you start to notice, wait a second, the mental impression of a snap is not the same. It even occurs in a different place usually. It sounds different. It's much more quiet. It has a sense of sound to it, but it's like imagined sound rather than sound. So it's not quite the same. And we take the echo to be the knowledge, the consciousness, the awakeness, the presence, the subject that is observing, except that if you just learn to pay attention better, you notice that's not true. And so it was actually just by increasing by the mental resolution by very straightforward techniques to be able to perceive this fine-grained aspect of what was happening in experience, it became very clear that in fact you've just got sensations that occur, and some of them appear to be an observer but actually aren't, and some of them appear to be a sense of past, but actually the thoughts of past occur now. And if we totally buy their content of past, we think there is a true past, rather than just noticing that was the thought that occurred now as an experience. And same with future. So when thoughts of future occur now, we generally think, oh, that is a true future. And we operate on it emotionally and cognitively as if it is, which is very useful for things like object permanence and planning and learning from the past and all that. But experientially, actually, in this moment, you can actually realize all thoughts of past occur now, all thoughts of future occur now. All sensations of this present moment are actually too transient to be a stable self that stands outside of causality. And it just turns out that the mental transformations that happen as a result of that process just happen to feel a whole lot better. And you can call it enlightenment or just some curious trick of increased perceptual speed and clarity and all of that came from straightforward meditation techniques to increase the precision and clarity about all of these things. And it becomes just like anything else. So, for example, like there are people who could, when I first started playing guitar, like trying to make a G chord, it was like I thought I had some kind of movement disorder, right? It's like, ugh. And now I make a G chord effortlessly. Or trying to play my first scale, dun, 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 was really painful, and now I can play scales easily. In the same way, you can learn to perceive sensations much more quickly and easily, and then eventually effortlessly, and they just become part of the clarity that results from just sensate clarity that you cultivated, with the sense of space and time's permanent things being seen through, the sense of a separate, stable self being seen through. That is what we're talking about when we talk about awakening, at least in the tradition I come from.
Interesting. So, okay. So I like that you said you're increasing the mental resolution, and you're talking about kind of increasing the speed at which you perceive things. It kind of sounds almost like in the way, say you're watching a 60 FPS, quite smooth, buttery smooth video, and then it seems like everything is just flowing together. It's a video. We know it's still images, and then if we have a high-speed camera, we can break down and see all the different still images. It's kind of like you're developing a high-speed camera for your everyday perception, something like that.
You could kind of call it that. It's like, it's actually like noticing the frame rate of the camera itself. So it's actually, you're not changing the frame rate. You're noticing what the frame rate is. And the frame rate changes. That's the other thing. It's not a stable frame rate. And with each kind of mode of insight development that you go through, something curious changes about both the frame rate and the harmonics of the frame rate. So it's kind of complicated. It's not just a steady pulse. The pulse changes. There are multiple pulses. It's three-dimensional. So it is kind of complicated. It's not like this is the easiest thing to do. It's not like a two-dimensional thing with a regular frame rate. That would be relatively easy by comparison. Sure. This is three-dimensional, intricate, involves a lot of sense modalities. So that's where it gets more complicated, and involves subtle things, again, like intentions and mental impressions, which take a little bit of, they're subtle, but they're not that subtle. You can know before you think a thought that even you had it, right? Think of, and you're trying to complete it, right? Because that thing, and you can start to notice that again and again and again in yourself.
So you have, for example, an intention, you have the actual action, and then your impression of the action. Whereas for us, I guess for a, the typical person, it feels like I had an intention and I did the thing. But then when you break it down, you realize the intention just arose, the thing just happened, and then your mental impression happened afterwards. And these are all separate things.
Right. And this is actually kind of a triplicate kind of stream, because an intention series to do a complicated action, this is a lot of little intentions and a lot of little monitoring, to get an action to do something coherent. And it's this continuous or seemingly continuous, but actually discontinuous, but lots of little intentions, lots of little mental impressions as we monitor an action and see how it's going to see where our fingers are, and are they doing the right thing? And is it progressing like we think it? And so there's all this little iterative thing that's happening, and it's fast, but it's not so fast that you can't comprehend it. Because if you couldn't comprehend it, then there would be no way to know where your hand was and know what it was doing and coordinate it. So it has to be comprehensible. It's just subtle, but it's not so subtle that you can't start to untangle it through straightforward techniques.
One of the first things that was very interesting to me about the concept of noting when I was reading about it in your book excuse me, was that, well, things are happening one after the other quite rapidly, or that's how it appears to happen when you really break it down. But in our typical day-to-day experience, it just kind of feels like everything is happening at the same time. Like I am aware of my breath at the same time that I'm talking to Daniel. I'm aware of the camera light. I'm aware of all these things in the room at the very same time. But in reality, it's more like we're like rapidly switching our awareness between these different things. So like one after the other.
These are intricately interlacing.
Okay. Yeah, which is, I had never really explored before. And even, I've done a decent amount of meditation. I haven't been on like a serious meditation retreat. So I'm probably kind of like a little baby beginner to to other people who have had such an experience.
Well, actually, I know people who have profound insights who have never been on a single retreat. So there is clearly a dose dependency, but there's a distribution curve around that dose dependency. So not everybody who has not been on a retreat is necessarily a beginner, nor have necessarily people who've been on lots of retreats still not kind of beginners.
Mm. So there's some kind of personal disposition towards it.
That's a complicated question. We don't know what that is. We actually have plans for possibly genetic studies and other factors that we can see if we can figure out what are some of the predisposing factors for insight or insight resistance. But yeah, that's something we're interested in studying through the EPRC.
Could you explain noting briefly?
Yeah, so noting is a technique that comes out of a sutra called One by One as They Occurred. It's in a book called The Middle-Length Discourses of the Buddha. And the technique was then sort of formalized by a guy named Mahasi Sayadaw out of Burma, who's a very famous monk, lived in the 20th century. And he was one of the first people to really advocate for intensive practice by lay people on intensive retreats. And the technique he ended up popularizing was called noting. And essentially what one does is, if you were on a noting retreat, you would learn how to sit for an hour and then walk for an hour. And when sitting for an hour, you would notice the breath rising and falling. And you would make a quiet internal word, rising, rising, falling, 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 as you notice the breath rising and falling. And then you would notice other sensations like the mind wandering, or like seeing or hearing or thinking or feeling or pain or restlessness. And you just make simple notes, pain, 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 each time the mind makes contact with the sensation, or pleasure or distraction, or breath rising, falling, falling. And then the same for the feet, lifting, moving, placing, or right, left. There are different ways to note the feet. There's 3 different styles, basically, some more elaborate than others, but all basically grounding attention in the physical sensations that make up the feet and the breath in the abdomen. And this is a very powerful technique, but it's also, I think of it as something of a beginner technique, beginner to intermediate, because the mind is actually much faster than we can note. There's amazing amount of experience and data pouring in. And so to be able to capture at a sensate level an appreciation of that richness eventually involves dropping the noting and doing what they call noticing. And if you're reading books on this, particularly my favorite insight book called Practical Insight Meditation by Mahasi Sayadaw, a lot of people don't notice when it transfers from using the word note to notice. And the problem is, in the Burmese, I think it's kind of different. In English, it's nearly the same word. And so noticing is just bare sensations, like the mind is making contact with, or appearing to make contact with, all the intricate sensations that make up experience, which can start coming in from any sense door and go very quickly. And this is mentioned in the text, whereas noting is slower, but also very helpful for just quieting the mind and starting to turn the linear thought stream, which often is the primary hindrance in meditation practice because people get lost in their thoughts, and instead turning one into inner thoughts to a monitoring device. So turning something problematic, hopefully, into something skillful that allows you to then Also begin to appreciate things like the interaction between an impression and the note of it, and the note of it and an impression. And so you start to get this back and forth mental thing that starts to highlight the fundamental sense of things oscillating, which is what's happening at a much more intricate level, three-dimensionally, and eventually starts getting you more able to appreciate that intricate interlacing of phenomena that are actually kind of interfering with each other, because there's really only so much bandwidth.
Okay. And the interesting thing about this was you were saying that it's essentially a skill, and you can get faster.
Yes.
As you practice, you get faster at it. Mm-hmm. So you might be having trouble, noticing your breath and noticing all the sensations that make up walking. And it's like this real jerky, kind of very difficult, like, okay, I intend to raise the foot. I raise the foot. I intend to put it down. I mm-hmm. feel the floor. I tend to grab the door, and it's all really clunky. But then after a while, you can really speed up the resolution and notice different things. One thing. So, for example, this is it was a kind of interesting experience for me. I don't know how accurate it is, but it seemed to be that I was trying the noticing the noting in the shower, and I was kind of noting my intention to grab the soap, my intention to lather it up, and so on. And then at some point I noticed as an intention arose, maybe right before it or immediately after it, some part of my brain was doing a locating function.
Yeah.
Like it was like intention, location, and then action. And it was kind of bizarre because I was like, whoa, I never noticed, I've never realized that there was anything like that. And at one point I was running, and then I noticed that the intention to turn right, the next turn, appeared the moment I saw the end of the road. And so, yeah, it was just very curious. I thought maybe that might give some people some insight into how this can progress, because I imagine people are hearing this and say, okay, you're just taking note of the different things you can do, like what, or the different things you're doing. How would that translate into any sort of profound spiritual insight?
Right. And so that mm-hmm. waking up of each of those processes that previously you had enough knowledge of to know that it was, in theory, you that was going to do something, but not, it's sort of subconscious or semi-conscious rather than fully conscious, right? Whereas when it starts to become fully conscious, it's like, oh, look at that thing that just arose, right? So often a lot of the sensations that make up the sense of a stable self, they're present just enough to give you the sense that there is still this illusion of continuity and of stability moment to moment, when experientially there is no such thing. But if you look at things more closely, though, and you do that long enough, that automaticity of consciousness, of clarity, of bringing things from the semi-conscious level to the much more conscious level, just becomes much more automatic. And eventually it just comes online as a full-time thing.
So is that you had this awakening and it's a permanent thing? Mm-hmm. And so is it like all these things are permanently, blatantly obvious to you now? Like,
it's a complicated answer. So first, to say it's a permanent thing. So what permanently stopped was the mind's obsession with trying to figure out which of these transient sensations was a stable self. So the permanent thing is that something appears to have stopped doing that. The stopping of that, it turns out, is really nice because it didn't need to do it at all. And it just took up a lot of mind time, kind of like a computer virus or some other process running in the background. Wait, this sensation is you. Oh, wait, that one's you. Nope, this one's you. That one's you. No, this is, oh, that's you. Okay, that one's you. That one's you. That one's you. It didn't need to do that. The thing was happening fine without it doing that. In fact, much better. So that's the first thing. It was actually stopping a process. So you can stop things permanently. Things can't exist permanently, but it seems to have stopped. So for 18 and a bit years, it hasn't seemed to have done that again, which is cool, because it didn't need to anyway. Reality was doing just fine on its own without a little process trying to do that. And so the next thing is so it's not a stable thing. It is automatic, but it's not like there's a hyper awareness of all little intentions all the time. once you make them conscious enough to flip over the fundamental interpretation, like the existential interpretation, it turns out you don't need to necessarily stay at that super high level of clarity to stop the process and have it stay stopped.
Hearing what you're saying now and what I remember when I was reading your book was, it seemed like you got to a point where you increased that mental resolution and the speed of perception so much that you could see everything or almost everything, where you see everything that is happening, where everything is arising, and how everything is stopping and arising, and it's just in the same moment, to where it's kind of like you had checked under every single rock that there was to check all at once, and there was no self, and then your brain was like, oh, this guy just proved that there's no self, and
right.
And now
that's basically it.
Permanently, really? Okay, that's
nicely summarized.
And so now you permanently have no self.
There's permanently an appreciation that there never was any self in this, that it was all just done by a process that was constantly like, oh, that's self, that self, that self, that self. But so
interesting.
It was kind of, and it was kind of amazing it could do it in such a transient and such an utterly ephemeral and transient field of changing experiences, that it could do that is actually seems like a magic trick. Like how was it able to pull off that illusion? It seems ridiculous now, but it was unbelievably compelling until it wasn't.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
It's like a kid learning there's no Santa Claus.
Right.
It's like, trust me, he's out there and he knows what you're doing. It's like, oh gosh, okay, Santa Claus watched me. And then you're like, what? There's no Santa Claus.
Right.
Okay. So the other thing about this speed of perception that you're talking about,
and not just speed, because the other thing you described is inclusion. So it's including a lot of stuff. So you're not just getting faster, you're also including things. So this has a three-dimensional multi-sensor inclusion to it. It's not just speed. It's also the capacity to accept in a clear way all of the components of experience. Right? So it's more than just, the skill is not just speed, but also inclusion and consistency and something of acceptance, right? So there are more components than just speed, right? And actually, curiously enough, some of the highest clarity states don't feel that fast, even though they kind of are. So,
okay, is it kind of a non-judgment thing? Is that
it's a non-judgment that even includes the fact that judgment occurs.
Okay.
So it's a meta acceptance that includes the capacity for judgment to arise and vanish as a natural unfolding of whatever occurred.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's not interesting. So it's not necessarily that there's no judgment. It's that when there is a judgment, you just notice it as its own little thing. As its own part of whatever is going on. Wow. Okay. So I think one interesting, when we're talking about this objectively, you might say, okay, how could anyone, he's saying all this, but how could anyone prove that they had any sort of increase in their speed of mental perception? And you were telling me last time you went into a lab. It was Judd Brewer's lab, neuroscientist, right? Neuroscientist Judd Brewer.
Yeah, nice guy. Very, very interesting innovator in this space.
Yeah, it's funny because I made a video in 2017 on the practical benefits of meditation. I talked about Judd Brewer.
Yeah, he writes some good stuff on that. The Craving Mind. He's got a new book out, and yeah, he does some cool stuff. So
yeah, why don't you tell us about the experiments in Judd Brewer's lab?
All right. So, yeah, this is a number of years ago. And actually, I've been up to Harvard recently, actually, for 2 weeks of playing around, doing some stuff kind of related to that, but a little more elaborate with some of the same people, actually. So Remco van Ludervelt is part of that team, and he was part of Judd's team as well back then. doing EEG stuff for him. Anyway, so I was there for a number of things, and one of the things they gave me was something called the attentional blink test. And the attentional blink test is something where they flash a series of images that have a orientation to them, like houses and trees and stuff, where you can tell which way up is, right? And then somewhere in that sequence of images is a disturbing image, a very challenging image. And these are some pretty gross stuff, like roadkill and worse. It's the kind of stuff you're like, pretty gory. And then there's another image that's in the sequence somewhere that is rotated either right or left. And what they're looking for is there attentional blink when you see the image? And then if the image that is rotated one way, see the graphic image, and then the image that is rotated one way or the other, if it happens within a few frames or of the gory image, are you so distracted by your own internal processing of the gory image that you miss which way it's rotated? And they do a lot of these, and you're basically just like, they show you an image stream, and then you just say you click right or left. It's like 2 keys on a keyboard or something. And then they show you the next one. You do this again and again and again and again and again. And the images start getting faster and faster and faster. And at some point, if I understand the test correctly, it should wash out to 50-50 probability of getting it right, because in theory, you shouldn't be able to perceive images that fast. So the tail of it is supposed to sort of serve as a control that it's supposed to go to 50-50 probability or something. Except that mine never did. So the images started coming so fast that it's literally, I can watch the kind of raster patterns of diagonal lines if it's interfering with the frame rate or the refresh rate of the laptop or whatever I was on, they were administering the test to me on. And I'm still nailing every single one because I can just phase. And I came out super excited from this test, and they were like, why are you excited about this test? And I was like, I felt like this is a test I was built to take, because within about 2 pulses, I could figure out what the frame rate was and just phase tune my attention pulse to the frame rate pulse and have them pulsing at the same frame rate. And then, of course, I capture all the images. And they're like, you're doing what? And I'm like, well, yeah, this is just what I had spent thousands of hours doing, is learning how to do these exotic phase tuning things. And initially, I couldn't have done anything like this. I couldn't feel my feet like the first time I tried to meditate, but I just trained and learned to do these unusual things, right? And so, like, I didn't miss any, which is apparently unheard of. And so he actually presented it at like a 400-person international neuroscience conference. And they all thought I was, some ASB weirdo, or that had some, like there was sort of weird disbelief, and they had me take some tests for, Asperger's. And, I think I am probably slightly neurotypical, but I didn't start out with any skills like this. This was a cultivated. And so, yeah, it's been demonstrated that I have some unusually fast perception ability, at least with regard to that specific test, right? So like another friend, Katie Devaney, did some studies with regard to perception of letters and numbers fast, but I'm a touch dyslexic. My brain jumbles letters and numbers in odd ways, so I didn't do as well on that test, to put it gently. So it's not like everything I'm super fast at. I'm not. But that specific test, I just happened to be unusually well designed for after a lot of training.
Do you like video games at all? Do you play any video games?
You want to hear a funny or a weird story?
Sure.
So I'm 17 years old and a serious computer nerd, and played a lot of video games and helped run my school's computer my senior year as a big VAX 11 780 mainframe that tells you the generation I'm from. And I was one day sitting on a chat program and had been chatting with my friend Sally for about half an hour. And then some noise or something happened in the room, and I looked up, and she was sitting right next to me, and had been for half an hour. And I had no awareness that she was literally like, her arm was like 4 inches from mine. And something in my brain snapped. And I quit doing computer stuff, except as need to, for something functionally useful. Period.
Really?
I was like, this is ridiculous. I have a problem. And it was an instant, I stopped playing video games. I didn't play another video game until just very recently, my step-granddaughter said, "Hey, will you play some Mario Karts with me?" And I'm like, okay. It was sort of a bonding thing. But that was the first video game I had played in over 30 years.
I mean, that realization of just how it's like you're in a trance. I've experienced that before. I mean, I used to play this rhythm game where at first you play it on your feet. It's called Dance Dance Revolution. And then I played it on my fingers, and it just, because it was too fast that my feet couldn't keep up. So I started playing on the faster songs on the keyboard. And then similar things have happened where like my brother is like waiting for 5 minutes for me to finish the song so he can ask me something. And I'm like, whoa, where did you come from? But I was going to ask you I was going to say something pretty it would be a trivial use of the ability that you've cultivated. But I was playing this game the other day. It's called Metroid Dread. And I was looking online how to do this kind of weird trick where you're trying to perform basically a glitch, and they're saying, well, it's a frame perfect input, meaning you have to, in the 30 frames per second of the game, you have to, at the moment that the character, the head of the character touches the ceiling, you have to press the fire button at the exact same time. And then I was reviewing for this interview, and I was like, "Oh, I bet Daniel could do that." He could probably perceive the individual frames of the game. But I had no idea what this person online was talking about. I was like, "Press it at the same frame? How do you even do that?"
Well, I actually have a friend who is a serious pro gamer of some, like a champion of some first-person shooter that actually was a part of the same study, and apparently did incredibly well when they were in the fMRI regulating their PCC, which is basically being able to downregulate the default mode network and be present. And it didn't surprise me, actually, because they had high degrees of known sustained concentration. And I think actually some of that was curiously cultivated through their very, very intense and unusual video game skills.
Interesting.
So I think there are probably parallels, pros and cons. Like you probably gain some things and lose others, I would guess, by playing video games. For
sure. I mean, I can be quite scatterbrained doing other things, but I can be hyper-focused on a game for sure. Speaking of the PCC and the default mode network, in that 2017 video I made a long time ago about the meditation, I said something basically along the lines of the default mode network is associated with mind wandering, and mind wandering is associated with kind of general unease or unhappiness. I mean, you have these ruminations about the past, these worries about the future. So there's a good chance of it generating some sort of discontent with your current experience. And so it's associated with that monkey mind of, oh, I got to do this, or, oh, that person thinks I'm dumb, or God, this shirt is so yellow, why did I wear this? Or whatever it might be. And it's just kind of like yammering in your head all the time. And all this is associated with a default mode network region. But it sounds like there's something odd about your default mode network, or how it activates, or when it activates. Can you tell us more about that test that you underwent?
So the other thing is I clearly can basically turn on and off my default mode network when I want to and hold it in whatever state. And so that's why they kept having me come up to UMass and play on their scanners when they were trying to get their EEG rig to mimic what the fMRI could do, right? Because an fMRI is a multi-million-dollar toy, and then the EEG was $80,000. They were trying to do the same kind of functionality of imaging the PCC, and then trying to get it down to a consumer grade, hopefully a few $1,000 home rig that they could learn to teach people how to deactivate their PCC on, which I think is a cool idea. The problem with this is that their meditative experiences where the PCC, instead of being deactivated, which is what makes you present in the room basically, is activated. And so there are meditation stages where an activation of the PCC and the ability to activate it turns out is very important. So for example, it's interesting when I was playing around the first time in fMRI with Judd and Willoughby there at Yale, they initially it was all these exercises designed to deactivate the PCC and to be in the room basically. And then eventually we had done all their stuff, and we were coming up with fun new things to do just to play around because we had some more time, scan time, and there was nobody after us. And it was like, oh, let's just play. And so then they were like, hey, see if you can try to figure out how to really activate the PCC. And I'm getting, about 8-second delayed feedback on this, so I can see what my PCC is doing. And they said, and I said, well, what do you recommend? And they said, well, think a bunch of neurotic thoughts. And I started thinking a bunch of neurotic thoughts, and it was not activating. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, thinking neurotic thoughts. And they're like, well, what are you doing wrong? I'm like, I don't know. I was like, oh, I'll bet I know what I need to do. I need to think like I used to think. And so I tuned out the room. I tuned out the scanner, and I just went into the thoughts and made the thoughts really big and made as much of the fMRI and body and everything go away. And then suddenly the PCC was activating. So I actually think it's the switch that tunes out the room. That's my impression of what the PCC is. It may do some other things, but my impression of it is basically if you're experiencing the body or sounds or sights that in sort of consensus space, whatever that is, right? It's going to be less activated. And when you tune out the room and you kind of go away. So what I was initially doing that was making it not activate was I was thinking neurotic thoughts in the room. So I don't think it's the neurotic thoughts. It's that when most people think thoughts like, oh, what's on my calendar next Thursday? And you can see their eyes go up and they kind of tune out and they're like checking in with this internal image. And it's easier to see an internal image if you can block out the monitors and the screen and the lights and the sound of the room. It's easier to do that if you have a PCC that can make all that go away, and then your internal images become a lot more clear by contrast, as far as I can tell. So there's value in being able to activate the PCC. And for like formless realms, I would guess that, I don't know for certain, but we were playing around with formless realms in the scanner at Harvard, and we'll see if that involves an activated or deactivated PCC. I would guess it involves an activated PCC, though I could be wrong, because I think you have to kind of learning to tune out the scanner. The fMRI is very loud. I think actually involves activating the PCC, but we'll find out. And actually navigating through what I would call the stages of insight through the dark night and the third Vipassana jhana seems to involve activating the PCC. And there's some evidence for that in a scan I did on EEG in Judd's lab at UMass when he moved up to UMass with John Kabat-Zinn, and I was coming up to play. And then also the Haggerty paper, as we call it, where Lee Brasington was basically put in a scanner and going through jhanas, and they were like, wow, the PCC is kind of activating in the third jhana, which makes sense to me actually, because I think some of the tranquility of the third jhana actually comes by sort of detuning some of the body and the space you're in. And that gives an increased tranquility when you're not bringing in much to fill that space. So the tranquility comes from exclusion from a lot of sense material and just resting in that excluded space.
Okay. So a jhana is essentially... It's
a meditative state.
Okay.
Like a trance state, or they start out rapturous and blissful, and then they get tranquil and coolly blissful, and then equanimous, and then eventually spacious and consciousness and formless. And so eventually things start disappearing.
Okay. Is the third jhana where you've basically lost any perception of your body, or was just the very first one?
Okay, so this gets into a really complicated question. The word jhana gets a lot of use and kind of abuse. So we really need a lot more terms, and there are lots of people who want to define various jhanas in various ways. And rather than coming up with lots of different terms, they just argue about what the original words mean, which I don't like, something I call term wars. And so academics do this too, but really they just need more terms. So there are jhanic states where the body is gone. And there are various criteria for jhana that people have. There's 4 major jhanas and then 4 formless realms or something. And then people have different definitions of what they would call each jhana. So you have very high standards and very low standards and standards everywhere in between. And then standards for what should be present and what should be excluded and to what degrees. And then you have dimensional thinkers regarding jhanas. Well, they'll say, You may have more bliss or less bliss, or more exclusion of hindrances or less, or more thoughts or less thoughts. And then you have categorical thinkers of jhana, where they say the only thing that is jhana is like no thoughts and no bodily sensations and only bliss and not the vaguest hint of mind wandering or whatever. So there are various places you can draw those categorical lines. So there's lots of ways to think about jhana, and the traditions all argue amongst themselves. And I actually don't care mostly, except that I understand what it is that people are talking about and can meet them where they are. And hopefully the language helps further their goals of reducing suffering and increasing happiness.
Okay. And I imagine there's some amount of machismo associated with it, like,
very much.
That's not a jhana. You should see my jhana. Okay.
To put it gently, that it definitely occurs. And and there can be something kind of fun in that, right? So like a little friendly gamesmanship and competition. Sportsmanship can be, or sportspersonship can be healthy, right? And so it's not like all of that is purely pathological or all purely whatever, because other people's things can, attainments can inspire one to attempt to do the same thing or even best them. And maybe that's all in good fun. But it also can become very dark and very macho asshole-y, excuse my language, and very competitive in a not good way. And so, yeah. And then sometimes it's hard to tell exactly where it falls on that spectrum. And there may often be both elements, the skillful and unskillful aspects of competition.
Okay. That reminds me of another question that I was meaning to ask you about, how maybe some myths around enlightenment, like you could be an enlightened person, but still have this maybe sense of competition. You can get angry with things. You can frustrated about things. Why don't we cover that real quick? Why don't you just cover some of, like, can you read people's mind if you're enlightened? Do you have, like, is every single moment of your day perfect and you're like happy and you never get stressed out? Or what are some of the misconceptions about enlightenment?
Right. So the first thing I would say is it's a huge topic and it could probably be a whole podcast. And in fact, it's a whole, like, almost 100-page or something chapter in my book, part 5, chapter 37, which is freely available online at mctb.org. Anyway, so if you want to read my whole take on this, you can go there. And I kind of take it apart meticulously and thoroughly. Yeah, there we go. Thanks. And so, but the point is that there are a lot of different models of awakening. And a lot of different standards, a lot of different traditions have very different ideas about this. And even individual practitioners within those traditions clearly argued about what it was. And this actually caused a lot of the great schisms within Buddhism, between Buddhist traditions, various ideals of what one should aspire to and what was possible in awakening broke up, the Hinayana or Theravada or whatever you want to call it, from the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, and even different strains of Mahayana arguing about whose emptiness is more empty, and the various tantric people, getting into pissing matches about what's the fastest way to Buddhahood and all this stuff, and even what these things mean. And the Zen people just going, oh God, like, done with that. We're just kind of basically throw all the maps out almost, except for vague words like Kensho and Satori, and not even tell you what those mean. And just because they were just basically sick of that whole ridiculous scene. And yet it's not that there can't be value in some technical lexicons and language and healthy debate about what is possible in this life in terms of operationalizing whatever full human potential is and reducing suffering. And so the debate still rages in all kinds of fascinating political forms today. But from my take on this, I have, when you do hang out a shingle and say you're awakened, you get to talk to a whole lot of people, and sometimes very fancy people who are known to have all kinds of attainments or thought to have them or whatever. And if you get to know some of these people, you actually get to see their actual lives. And if you get to spend enough time around them and actually hear them get to be human and just kind of get off the pedestal and talk like ordinary people, just like people talking shop, or just, hey, we're just two people here talking about our experiences, and get real like that, you get to realize there's quite a wide range out there of what occurs. And the biggest questions are, one, you mentioned the powers. So the powers, do enlightened people all get powers? The answer is no. So there are people with powers who aren't awakened, and people who are awakened without powers, and people who have both, and people who have neither, and all the combinations you would imagine. And so it's no guarantee of powers necessarily, and demonstration of powers is not any guarantee of anything else. So that's its own skill set. And that was talked about in the old texts, a lot of different texts, and that's seen today. So in terms of emotional transformation, that's another fascinating topic. And the question is, does it eliminate, just bad emotions, or just certain emotions, or all emotions, or does it transmute all emotions into their awakened equivalents, or does it, there are all these different ideals of, or does it do nothing and you're just an ordinary human who just happens to be awake to ordinary humanity? These are all hotly debated topics, or does it just make, all the emotions just move through like weather without identification in some kind of way? There are all these different models of what happens with emotions. And let's just say this is still a hotly debated topic. A lot of controversy. The things that I can say from my own experience seem to have occurred is that the emotions and thoughts in general gain a high degree of what I call proportionality and perspective. So little sensations of fear or anger or little wispy thoughts of, jealousy or whatever are very small generally. They're usually not that strong as sensations. They're usually an incredibly small part of the room and the overall experience of whatever. And also when thoughts are observed to be these transient wispy little things, so fun exercise, stay in the room right now with full attention to the monitor and camera and microphone and chair and body and everything. And without losing any of that, think, and not moving your eyes up to the side, think a thought that you know to be triggering of some feelings and sensations. Like, what portion of your experience was that?
Oh, geez.
In terms of the sheer volume of sensations, if you didn't lose the focus of the room.
4%.
4%, you think? So that would be 4 cubic feet. Oh, 0.4. 0.4?
I'm very small. It's hard to put a number to it. It's like less than 5%, maybe even less than 1%.
Right. Exactly. So if you're in the space and thoughts are just these wispy little subtle things that can convey a message and then disappear, and even the physical sensations that might result from them are these little things here, and they might be this big or something. It's an incredibly small portion of experience, and usually not nearly as bad as, say, being kicked in the shin, or how sore my arm was from my Moderna vaccine, or whatever. And so, which wasn't that bad, actually. It was okay. And if you have that kind of proportionality and perspective on board as just your baseline, that is incredibly transformative. And then whatever sensations do arise don't last nearly as long. The physical sensations don't trigger as many mental sensations. The mental sensations don't trigger physical sensations. The sensations in the body don't last that long. And so the emotions, whatever, can convey their message with some sense of sensitivity and compassion, hopefully, and kindness and empathy and remorse and all these important feelings. But they don't overwhelm. They're just a small part of the space. So they can be a messenger, but they don't become this huge monster of a thing that then takes over and takes away from just being here in the presence of the room you're in, or the field, or the car, or the whatever it is.
What's really interesting about that is it reminds me of something neuroscientist Andrew Huberman was talking about on a podcast. So it sounds, to give a visual example, it kind of sounds like what you're describing. Of course, you're doing this with all your senses, but to give a visual example, it's kind of like you, instead of always just being focused on whatever you're focused on, like I'm just focused on the screen, like you always have awareness of your peripheral vision, kind of.
Not quite. It's not that there isn't the ability to focus, but the default is very wide. It's not like things can't be excluded or things can't be tuned out. I can still go into a coffee shop that's noisy and read a book, for example.
You can, of course.
It's not like...
I was going to say, you could, of course, do that, but it's like your default tendency is kind of more...
The default tendency is extremely inclusive and lends itself to that kind of proportional relationship to human experience.
Okay. Then this might not be
what I would call very right-sized.
Right-sized? What do you mean? Oh, everything is just as important as it should be?
It's just the size it is.
Okay.
Like thoughts. How much of your sensate experience is a thought right now?
Very.
Think the loudest sound you can. How does it compare to the sound of me in your headphones?
It's tiny. Very
right,
small.
It's tiny.
Even an explosion.
Create the strongest image you can. How does that compare to the glare of your lights and everything?
Oh, it's like it's like nothing. That's like a little ghost.
And that's because in that moment, you have a high degree of sensate clarity of what the experience is, rather than just what the content is. So it's the experience of thoughts that helps give you an increased ability to deal with the content of thoughts.
Okay. Huh.
And this is why we spend so much time training to be clear about what our experience is, because that kind of training makes access to this that much easier and eventually is just on tap for you.
Well, so you have the monkey mind. You have these little thoughts of, oh, I should do that. I should have done that. I got to do this. But they're just little tiny things. Okay. That's got to be pretty nice.
Yes. I would highly recommend it. It's the wisest thing I ever spent time and resources on.
Okay.
And I have unbelievable gratitude to all the people who figured this stuff out originally and then transmitted it down to me and taught me for free and were just so kind, because I would not have figured this out on my own. I'm not that smart, but I could follow instructions from smart people who could teach well.
And that,
right. And who, so thanks be to them, because it's unbelievably transformative.
That's what was so interesting about your book is you were essentially communicating that the Buddha had these lectures, and like you were saying, the one by one sutra, for example, it's like he's pointing to something specific. Yeah,
it's in that book right there.
The yellow.
And these books, no, that one right there, the kind of beigeish one.
Okay.
See right where my finger is. And then that's like a whole bunch of polytext right there.
Oh, cool. Is that
and then
the
commentary.
Is that the one you have there?
Huh?
Is that the manual?
Oh, Manual of Insight. Yeah, it's right there.
Cracked that open after I got your book. It's pretty
good stuff.
Pretty intense. But yeah, it's these old scriptures are trying to convey a kind of quite specific things, like a specific set of instructions of how to direct your awareness and how to do that to improve your meditation progress. And even, I guess is it a Theravada thing? The 16 stages of insight, is that a Theravada thing? Okay, yeah.
That is a Theravada thing.
So that concept of, hey, here's a specific thing you do. It's kind of like mastering a skill. And then you're making progress because there's 16 milestones that you will achieve as you go along. And it's not like you're just kind of meditating and, it's nice and I guess I'm more focused and I'm less anxious. And okay, I do it every day for 30 years and I have a Kensho experience and I'm enlightened. Whereas, not to rag on Zen so much, but Zen was always just very fuzzy, and it was like enlightenment was the elephant in the room that they didn't want to talk about. And then if you do ask about it, it's like, oh yes, the master held a finger up and then the boy was enlightened after he cut off the boy's finger. I'm like, what the heck?
Yeah.
It's just super fuzzy, no sort of instruction or, of course, there are many things useful in Zen, but
actually, there's a tremendous amount of awesome stuff in Zen.
Okay.
Right. So it is true. Map-wise, they pretty much suck as badly as it gets. To be fair, to be straight up honest, I'm being emotionally and linguistically honest here. But there's a lot of great stuff in Zen, and they point out a lot of problems with the maps. And actually, if you read books like Shobo Genzo, right, by Dogen, unbelievably cool. And his practice enlightenment focus that is just these sensations right here, that it's not over there. It's practice enlightenment. He says that again and again. What do you mean by practice enlightenment? It is these sensations here, clearly perceived, that are it. Because what other sensations could it be? So Zen is a very, very necessary counterbalance to all the problems that came from all the maps and all the competition, all the comparison, and all the future mind and all the striving. And it does pretty much better than anyone a counterbalancing against all of that confounds maps in the rational mind and just gets you into the immediate flow of your experience and emphasizes that again and again, and emphasizes real inquiry through its koan system, and emphasizes a letting go of a sense of a future in which you will be this or another person, these are just thoughts arising, right? And also not being fixated on the powers and all the weird crazy that can come from, focusing on the powers and stuff, right? So Zen is very necessary in the space. And I'm super glad they're in the space and developed the way they did, right? Because they held, if like, cultivate all these insight stages was thesis, like Zen became antithesis. And then with the thesis and the antithesis, you as a practitioner can come up with synthesis, which is how to relate to both of these systems in a way that is skillful and draw from the benefits of both of them, without which Buddhism would not be nearly as complete or able to address some of its own shadow sides. And so Zen, heck yeah, amazing. And yet, I agree, baffling, confusing, sometimes super weird and like, what? But that's part of their pathology and charm, right? And so, right, but and there's pros and cons to everything. There's pros and cons to mappy traditions, to non-mappy traditions, to fusion traditions that attempt to get the best of both worlds, right? And so it's very important that you have the option of non-mappy traditions, because there are clearly some people who, when you put in a mappy tradition, they get utterly future obsessed and comparative, and then they cannot be in the natural flow of their intimate direct reality. And the mappy tradition just messes them up. And there are other people that just flounder, and all of a sudden you give them a map and they're like, oh, that's how to do it. And then they just do it, right? And then they just nail it, right? And you see both. And people sometimes move around in that. They may have done well in a mappy tradition for a while and then get totally screwed up by it and then benefit from Zen, or they may, so you see these, but then go back to the thing once they realize something. And so it's very important that voices like the Zen points of view, which Zen is a diverse tradition, right? It's not just one tradition, obviously. It's a bunch. But that kind of range, that neighborhood is very important.
Okay. I see. It's kind of an antidote to that, for example, the machismo of the jhanas and stuff, because if you're in jhana 1 and you're quote unquote, you're in jhana 4 and you're like, wait, maybe this is only jhana 1, then that isn't not keeping you focused on your immediate experience, which is the whole point. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. And I think the interesting thing is that I want to say Zen Buddhism is probably the most popular form of Buddhism in America, or in the West in general. And
I don't know the numbers.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I guess just in terms of general, oh yeah, I kind of know it. I guess general impression of people, not necessarily practitioners, but just the layperson who knows it's a thing, knows Buddhism is a thing. Usually when they think of Buddhism, they think of Zen, is my perception. I don't know the numbers. I guess my perception is also kind of biased. But my point is, I had never heard of Theravada Buddhism until getting into this. And so it was, the whole concept of a map was really interesting. Just real quick to tie up that point on your having the room in frame as your default. As you were saying, the default mode network being off isn't it's not always necessarily the better to have it off. Sometimes it's good to have it on. But yeah, I remember Andrew Huberman was talking about how kind of eye movement can affect your mental state. And he was saying that if you're feeling stressed, try and get back in tune with your peripheral vision, or focus on your peripheral vision, and for a lot of people, that de-stresses them. When you're in nature, for example, say you're standing on top of a mountain and just looking out at the vista, most of the time, you're not really focusing on one thing. You're just kind of taking it all in. And there's something about this taking it all in that seems to be very relaxing for people.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's quieting
and the higher jhanas are actually quite wide generally. So the higher jhanas tend to get wider and wider until they finally get more exclusive and things start disappearing. But the higher jhanas generally get wider. And most people think, oh, better concentration will be more teeny or more focused or more like, ugh. But it turns out actually the most advanced forms of concentration are very wide, expansive, eventually diffuse and boundless and all of that. And so, yeah. And that is definitely is a great trick for deactivating the default mode network. And also that's very much a sort of a Dzogchen thing. So Dzogchen and Mahamudra are traditions that are actually way more complicated than what I'm about to say. But in their sort of pop form, I will say, they tend to emphasize starting with space first and then resting in a space-like meditative equipoise where you're sort of just, there's space and you hold the space, you hold the view of space, and then holding the view of space, things arise and vanish in that space, and you get very used to staying very in the room. So they're actually taking result as object from the beginning or whenever they determine you're advanced enough to do those techniques. And so there are traditions that actually very much start from that place, which can be very skillful for some people.
We were talking about there's these 16 stages of insight progression, and at first it sounds like you start to let me open that page. Like it's you start to get in tune with the fact that things are arising and falling. Like you have the arising of an intention, the actual thing happening, and then the impression of it, right? Maybe that's a different thing. But sorry, what was that the very first stage of insight called?
The very first one is actually called mind and body.
Okay, there you go.
And this is a great one, and this is really important. And it's where you learn to see thoughts as objects and physical sensations as objects. So when you're able to see a thought as a thought, there's a thought. Oh, wait, I'm not necessarily that thought. Rather than being totally contracted into the thought, you can see that's a thought. This is revolutionary for some people who have always been totally caught in their thoughts. And to be able to see a thought as an object, and, oh, that was just a thought. I didn't necessarily have to buy that or whatever. And then that was a physical sensation. Oh, wait, that's just a physical sensation. Check that out. That's a physical sensation. Particularly regarding the emotions, this can be huge. And mindfulness as a tradition makes great use of this, what I call horizontal work, where you're just taking that basic insight and working it for all it's worth. And it's a great one. And it can be revolutionary for people who have never been able to not be caught in their thoughts and not be contracted into them and totally identified with them and not be totally identified with physical sensations. And then you can start to notice what we call cause and effect, stage 2, where like a thought might arise and then a physical sensation related to that thought is an emotion. And then that physical sensation arising might cause another thought. And then that thought arises and then there's another physical sensation. And you can just start to see these feedback loops between thoughts and other emotional components. And you can also start to notice, wait, there's an intention that occurs before an action. Wait, I intended to move my hand and then I moved my hand. I intended to pull it back and then I pulled it back. And so, and you can start to notice, wait a second, there was a snap and then there was a mental impression. There's the sound of the snap that you can play back. Wait, that's a mental impression. That's a snap. That's a mental impression of a snap. Wait a second. Those are two different things. And so you start to see this cause-effect relationship between intentions and actions, between sensations and mental impressions, between thoughts and physical sensations of feelings, between physical sensations and the thoughts that arise about them, pleasure or pain. And you start to, wait a second. Now you've seen the fundamental components of the system. So those are the first two critical insights of starting to get a handle on how this human mind, brain, heart, body thing works.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And That's really interesting because I just recently was doing something a little similar to that with my friend. We were, what was it? We were talking, we were having a conversation. We were talking about one thing, and then we were like, wait, how did we get on this topic? And then we were kind of like, well, you said this, and so then I thought of this, so then I said that, and then but before that you said this, and it was kind of this little like cascade of what domino came before the next domino. And so you're kind of noticing that in your own body of like.
But you can watch it in real time with regard to how your emotions unfold. There might be a thought of a loved one, and then all of a sudden a warm feeling arises in your heart, or a thought of a person you don't like and a sense of, right? Or you might, suddenly feel some pain in your back and your mind goes, oh, my back again, and you can start to watch this kind of back and forth interactivity, and then maybe the thought, oh, my back again, and causes a sense of tension that contracts and the back gets, and then you can start to watch these feedback loops, both positive and negative, that negative in terms of like more negative, more unpleasant sensations leading to more negative sensations, or more positive sensations leading to more positive sensations. And you can start watching how whole feelings, either good or bad, are generated through this interactivity and iterative process of mental sensations and physical sensations and stories and everything feeding into each other, right? Because our hearts and our emotional bodies react to thoughts the same way we react to things in the room, right? And so our heart, mind, body, emotional structures can't seem to tell the difference very well. But if you give them enough sensate clarity, they can start to notice, wait a second, that wasn't that person. I don't have to give that the full thing that I would give to the person here in the room. That was just this wispy little nothing. Really? Okay.
That's really interesting because I was reading this book. I wish I could remember it. Lisa Barrett, something or other. She wrote this book about emotions, and one of the big things she was saying was that you don't necessarily have emotions. What you have are a specific grouping of feelings in the body. And then at some point you evaluate that specific grouping of feelings as anxiety or fear or whatever it might be. And so what was really interesting was she was saying how like the formula, if you pay really close attention, you can notice that each emotion is like a formula. So you can have a formula for exhilaration or for intense anxiety. And the example she gives is, well, if you're riding on a roller coaster, all the components of being in incredible fear are there, but you experience it as exhilaration, probably because you have this component of a sense of control. But then let's say, you have a very similar experience, but it's like a runaway car. Your car lost its brakes. You got all the same stuff, but then without that sense of control, it becomes very negative. You ascribe a different emotion to it.
Exactly. And you can watch that whole process very rapidly and iteratively unfold in real time. And that's fascinating. And even the meta perspective that allows you to see all that is a benefit, because then you're just watching it as this process in some ways. And so initially you use the sense of a watcher to eventually deconstruct the sense of a watcher.
Did you get some kind of like a benefit of your meditation experience? So for example, I'm really interested in health and self-improvement and these fitness, whatever it might be, those kind of things. And so I like to play around with a bunch of different supplements like herbs, tinctures, whatever it might, kind of like, oh, this is supposed to increase testosterone. That's supposed to lower prolactin. That's supposed to increase serotonin or whatever. So I'll take it, be like, did I really did this really even do anything? Was it really worth paying $30 for this? And so I'm trying to like, nail down, like, is anything actually having an effect? And so a good thing about that is, and this also comes from doing some meditation myself, being more mindful, is I can say what my girlfriend is saying is not actually unreasonable at all. I've just had twice as much coffee as I usually had, and I'm playing And for some reason, I'm subjecting myself to playing this game that I know irritates me because there's this frustrating section, and so we just happen to have a conversation right after those things, and so I can piece things out. I'm wondering, do you get really clear with that? Like, oh, this really, things aren't as bad as I thought. I just had a little bit too much coffee, or I took that weird brand of coffee that was, not my typical brand of coffee, and it made me feel bad. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, so it's not like you gain perfect insight into always exactly why you feel a certain way, but it definitely helps with that kind of meta perspective that can evaluate things with more space rather than just being totally caught in it. So I've definitely noticed that.
Okay, you have a kind of better sense of cause and effect.
Again, we don't always perfectly know why we're feeling things, and sometimes it takes a little time to get clearer answers about exactly why, because our emotional lives are very complicated, right? And there's a lot of pattern recognition that we barely have access to, even if we've spent a lot of time training our minds to be clear. And that's why I still think psychotherapy and getting to the subconscious or the unconscious or whatever is valuable, because we don't get to see every single thing behind the curtain of exactly why we feel everything. But there are techniques and tricks to help get a better sense of why we're feeling what we're feeling, particularly when it doesn't seem to totally line up or seems out of proportion or old or like a loop, something stale that's not really relating just to the freshness of our immediate situations. Not that we can ever do that. We respond based on causality and conditioning. And we're mammals that have learned a lot, we think, about how the world is. And we're constantly doing pattern matching, right? And so all new emotional situations are compared to older, similar emotional situations, and old patterns of reaction still come up. So I still highly recommend people do various psychotherapeutic exercises and or therapies and or explorations to try to figure out some of those. But it is generally true that on the spiritual path, if you do enough meditation, you end up having to do a bunch of that. But meditation doesn't often cut it. I think there is lots of work to be done in community with other people, with professionals, etc.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that on the topic of myths about enlightenment. Like, it doesn't, these spiritual insights don't necessarily resolve any lingering issues you might have with your family or your friends or whatever it might be. Okay.
Right. Again, just a proportional understanding is not the same as what's arising in that proportional understanding being perfectly skillful.
Okay.
Whatever that would even mean.
So recently, psychedelics have been a lot bigger topic, especially with a lot of people like Tim Ferriss trying to get Tim Ferriss, Roland Griffiths, a bunch of people trying to make it more mainstream so they can be used in a useful way. And one of the things about this is, as you were describing some of the progresses that happened towards insight, it sounded like some of the things you were describing sounded quite psychedelic. And just to add my experience very briefly, this was very light. I don't think I made any sort of progress on the path of insight, but I was in Amsterdam once, and I did quite a heavy dose of psilocybin mushrooms, and then
the truffle culture there is huge.
Yeah, it was very cool, and I so at the start and the middle of the trip, all kinds of wacky things happened, and then near the end, when I was coming down, it just seemed like everything was so magnified and super interesting, to where, kind of like we were talking about with the process of noting, how you're noting every little thing as best as you can, and you try and really pay attention to it. Like, okay, there's an intention, I'm moving my foot, I put my foot on the floor, there's a sound. It was like that was the default state in that time, where everything was just super magnified. So I kind of couldn't ignore it. Of like the noise of my foot touching the ground was super loud in my head, and my arms seemed really huge. So it was this interesting thing where things seemed so quiet when that was happening. Like just all the movements of my body were just so loud that the whole background noise that's typically there would just seem super quiet. And then I was trying the noting thing. I had been doing it for a good hour or so, and I was walking around trying to focus on each little thing as best as I could. I was like, whoa, this feels really familiar. I was like, oh yeah, it feels a lot like what was happening to me in Amsterdam. So I mean, I'm not trying to make any wild promises about, doing an hour session of noting or anything, but I just wanted to touch on that topic a little bit because, do you have much experience with psychedelics? Did it seem like some of these states that come from progressing on the path of insight are akin to psychedelics, anything like that?
Yeah, so I have done 3 different psychedelics over the years, over 30 years, not that many times. So, and I have actually a whole podcast on this. If someone wants my vastly more extensive take on this, you can look up a talk I do with a guy named Amir Giles, and we talk about psychedelics. So if you want my long deep dive into this topic, but the parallels have been noted again and again and again. And I talked to a very large number of people on the insight path, meditative path, whose psychedelics either have been or are or shortly will be some part of their journey. And there are a lot of parallels. There are some dissimilarities. Psychedelics, it's kind of like the difference between scuba diving and learning to be a fish. It takes a lot longer to learn to be a fish, but you can go scuba diving, in a quick course, at the beach or whatever. And so, and it's kind of like that. So it gives you taste of things. It's not quite necessarily the same, but they're obviously related, and related skill sets for navigation, related issues of processing. I think they can actually get people into stages and states that, if not near equivalence, might be, or actually potentially totally identical, are very, very similar. And sometimes we don't know. So there's actually a lot. We actually, the EPRC and Emergence Benefactors are working with some people at Imperial College London, in particular Dr. Chris Timmerman, trying to figure out what are the similarities between meditative states and psychedelic states. I may be involved in a study there. We're going to try to share data between the Harvard meditation studies we're doing and their lab to try to, through an Oxford neuroscience research team, trying to figure out what are the similarities and differences between deep meditative states and psychedelic states. And so those are projects we're working on. But obviously, those are all really interesting topics that have been hotly debated and probably will be for quite a while. But we're working on getting what neuroscience data we can on them, not that we can measure everything, and exactly what the correlation is between the meat brain and consciousness is obviously a very hotly debated topic as well. And we're not taking a position on that, but we think there are likely some parallels we will be able to see. And we're not the first to have thought that. So, yes, it's something we're playing with. But again, check out my podcast with Amir Giles for a long discussion of psychedelics and meditation and awakening.
Okay, sure. I think that's a great segue into the EPRC because, for example, if you go to a doctor and you're saying, like, I'm having all these, this crazy experience inside my head, they say, well, did you take anything? It's like, oh yeah, I took a hit of acid. They're like, okay, well, you'll be fine. Let's not worry about it. You're not schizophrenic. You don't have any mental issues. You're good. Let it pass. But then people can get themselves into, you've talked a lot about what you call the dark night. It's where actually on the path of insight, in progress in this meditation path, you can actually get into, you can launch yourself into some pretty dark territory, and people don't realize that that can actually be part of the path, so to speak. And so if you...
And it even sometimes happened to people who are not meditators, not spiritual practitioners. There's some people who just get into this territory. And sometimes when they're oddly young, and sometimes through childbirth, and sometimes through other curious experiences, and sometimes through very intense military training exercises, and all kinds of situations where the brain is able to get to these heightened states of intensity and then can start going through this progression. And so it's not just meditators, it's lots of different types of people. And yeah, so then the problem is the clinical mainstream has no good boxes for that. Their boxes are either drugs, which, oh, you're doing drugs. Okay. But if you're not doing drugs, then they've got psychosis, schizophrenia, schizotypal, bipolar with psychotic features, or if you're super lucky, adjustment disorder or something like that. And so they delusional disorder, hallucinations, they don't have things that can give the proper due to experiences that I myself have spent a lot of time cultivating and finding incredibly valuable, and plenty of my friends and colleagues on this strange journey. And so the goal of the EPRC, or Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, is one of the goals, I should say, is to try to give clinicians in the field and the public at large an increased appreciation of the range of what we're calling emergent territory, which is basically spiritual, mystical, magical, psychedelic, energetic experiences. So that's my long, very formal way of saying mindfulness and psychedelics are scaling. The clinical world is pretty much just beyond useless when it comes to this stuff. And we got to help them be some other way than that and help the public make good choices.
When you were on your path of progressing through the insight stages, you returned to what you call the dark night many times.
Yeah.
And so how would, let's say, past Daniel had access to something like the EPRC is trying to achieve, how would that have helped him through his meditation journey?
Yeah. So the first thing is, hopefully I would not have been terrified to tell anybody what was going on with me for fear they would think I was crazy, which as a teenager I was. And luckily I didn't tell anybody because, as the people I would have told later admitted, they wouldn't have done anything useful with that and would not have appreciated what was going on in a skillful way. So the next thing is the ability to normalize stuff, to be able to say, oh, that's this. And we recognize that and we know what that is. And we also might even be able to predict what comes next, and to be able to say, hey, we have techniques that can allow you, depending on what you want your relationship to this thing to be able to calm it down, or to be able to ramp it up, or to be able to use it for deep dive exploration, or just be able to kind of turn it off to the degree that that's possible so you could function, or whatever. We have various strategies that hopefully don't involve very expensive medications that cause metabolic problems and all this tolerance and withdrawal symptoms and all these things. We have various options for you that have been well time tested and developed such that you could choose between these. Or, if you're really interested in a medication option, here's the pros and cons. And just be able to have that as a very neutral, functional conversation in the way plenty of us who help people with these experiences are able to have that. So I wish they had access to the kind of stuff that later my meditation teachers and friends on the spiritual path were able to do some of those things and help me learn how to help other people in that way. And it would have been great if that level of care, of expertise, was available to me as a kid.
So we were talking about the different the stages of insight, and 1 through 5 sound kind of cool or maybe nice, but then is 5 part of the dark night, knowledge of dissolution?
Technically, yes. So for those who don't know what you're talking about,
I'll talk about.
So number 1 is mind and body, okay, which is fine. You see thoughts as thoughts. Number 2 is cause and effect. Number 3 is called the 3 characteristics, which actually can have some weird postural asymmetries and back pain and jaw pain and some other weird kind of hard pain stuff. And then the arising and passing away is the stage, vibrations, kundalini stuff, energetic openings, bright lights, maybe powers, spiritual highs, peak experiences, conversion experiences, all that kind of stuff. So it tends to be pretty up Not everybody likes it, but most people do. Yes, a lot of people cross what I would call the arising and passing away in psychedelics. Not everybody agrees with those maps. There's some real controversy here about whether or not those are equivalents or whether or not people even get into these insight stages outside of Theravadan retreat contexts, which I don't believe, but some people do. Okay. And so next after that, as things start dissolving, the stage of dissolution, it can be kind of mildly couch potato where you actually have your whole body dissolving through the floor, or just very kind of calm and peaceful, not much going on, but all the sense of power that you had in the arising and passing away stage can kind of be gone. And then next is fear, misery, disgust, desire for deliverance in a boringly named, but really potentially nasty stage called reobservation, before you get to the open, expansive, very beautiful, often easy stage of equanimity, and then get to stages of awakening. So that's basically the map, right? But those dark nighty stages don't have to be a big deal. They don't have to last very long. They might be seconds or minutes. They could be much longer. They don't have to be that intense, though they can be. And there's lots of debate about the best ways to avoid these or mitigate them or relate to them skillfully or give people a heads up as to what they might be without scripting them into freaking out. And so that's a hotly debated topic, which again, we just need better science and data on. And these kinds of dark experiences are described in a lot of traditions. This is the hero's journey into the underworld. This is the knowledges of suffering in Buddhism. This is the dark night of the soul of Christianity. And even are these the exact same thing or kind of different things? Even that is debated. And so we need a lot better science and phenomenology to help sort out exactly what is going on here. But we know things are going on, basically highs, lows, and weirds, right? Highs, lows, and weirds are sort of the things, and then these sort of transcendent plateaus. And so those are the things that we need to figure out. What are the neural correlates of? What do they lead to clinically? How do we cultivate more of the good stuff and deal with more of the bad stuff in some skillful way? So yeah, that's basically one of the major things the EPRC project is about. And how do you incorporate that into the clinical mainstream in a way that will scale globally and that they will accept, and that you can get into the DSM and ICD-10 and 11 billing codes and national health service protocols and reimbursement by insurance and board specialty exam questions and all of that. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's the big challenge. And that's why we think this will take quite a long time and cost quite a lot of money. So if you happen to have a whole lot of time, talent, and or money, and you're interested in helping with this project, please get in touch with us at info@theeprc.org. That's info@theeprc.org. Thanks for that shameless plug for our research group.
No, of course, yeah. I'm happy to put something on the screen. And so that's essentially the emergence benefactors then is essentially facilitating the project, is generating the funding necessary.
Emergence benefactors. Yeah, that's the board, regulated, registered, audited charity with bylaws and bank accounts and, AML, KYC stuff and all the stuff you need to do to be a fully functioning charity. And Emergence Benefactors is a charity designed to support the EPRC and its allies like, Assist and Quellia Research Institute and people that are also doing great work in the space that are aligned with our basic vision of what we're trying to do.
Great. Okay, great. Well, Daniel, thanks so much. Is there anything else about anything you wanted to talk about or anything you wanted to mention about the EPRC or whatever it might be?
Oh, this has been delightful. I just appreciate the opportunity to explore these things and to hear your thoughts on it. And hopefully those watching have learned something practical that they can do something useful with, and or at least gained a perspective on controversies that they can help sort out for themselves. Mm-hmm. So